Sometimes when someone accepts me, I immediately start wondering what they really want. Not because they did something wrong, but because something about their acceptance feels suspicious. They listen to me calmly. They don't criticize. They don't try to correct me. They don't look uncomfortable when I say something imperfect. And instead of relaxing, my mind quietly starts scanning the situation. Why are they being this understanding? Are they just being polite? Do they want something later? Are they going to change their mind once they know me better? It's strange how quickly that reaction appears. Someone treats you well, and instead of relief, your brain starts searching for the hidden condition. You replay the conversation later. You analyze their tone. You remember small moments and wonder if you missed something. Because part of you learned a long time ago that acceptance usually comes with an expiration date. At first people seem open, understanding, patient. But eventually something shifts. They start noticing things. They start reacting differently. They become less patient, less relaxed, and suddenly the acceptance you thought was real becomes something conditional. Something fragile. So when someone accepts you easily now, your system doesn't fully trust it. It watches. It waits. It tries to figure out when the shift will happen. Not because you want to doubt people, but because your mind learned that acceptance often doesn't stay the same once people see enough of you. And when that pattern repeats enough times, even genuine acceptance can feel like something you shouldn't believe too quickly. There are moments when someone treats me with a kind of calm acceptance that should feel comforting, but instead it makes me slightly uneasy. Not in an obvious way. Nothing dramatic. Just a small tension somewhere in the background of my mind. It usually starts in very ordinary situations. Like when I'm explaining something about myself and the other person just listens. They don't interrupt. They don't correct me. They don't say something like, "Well, you shouldn't feel that way." They simply nod. They stay present. They accept what I'm saying without trying to change it. And for a brief moment, there's silence. The kind of silence that should feel peaceful. But inside my head something quietly starts asking questions. Why are they being so understanding? It's strange how quickly that thought appears. Because the situation itself is completely normal. Two people talking. One person listening. Nothing unusual. But part of my mind starts looking for the missing piece. Where is the judgment? Where is the correction? Where is the moment when they tell me what I should have done differently? Sometimes it even happens in small everyday interactions. For example, I might admit something slightly embarrassing. Maybe I tell someone that I procrastinated on something important. Or that I made a mistake at work. Or that I handled a conversation badly. Usually when people say those things out loud, they expect some kind of reaction. Advice. Criticism. A reminder that they should have done better. But occasionally the other person just says something simple. Something like, "That happens." Or, "I understand." And they leave it there. They don't make it bigger. They don't turn it into a lecture. They don't try to analyze me. They just accept the moment as it is. And strangely, that calm response sometimes feels unfamiliar. Almost suspicious. My mind starts replaying the interaction. Did they really mean that? Were they just being polite? Maybe they didn't fully understand what I was saying. Maybe they weren't paying attention. Maybe if they thought about it more carefully, they would react differently. It's interesting how quickly the brain starts building explanations. Because simple acceptance can feel incomplete. Like something is missing. Sometimes the reaction is even more subtle. Someone might compliment something about me. Maybe they say they appreciate the way I handled a situation. Or they say they enjoy spending time with me. And instead of simply accepting the compliment, my mind immediately starts adjusting it. They probably don't know the full story. They're just being nice. They haven't seen the parts of me that are harder to deal with. The compliment doesn't land the way it probably should. It doesn't settle. It floats around for a moment and then my mind quietly pushes it aside, because something about it doesn't fully match the internal picture I have of myself. And when something doesn't match that internal picture, it can feel unreliable. Another place where this reaction shows up is in relationships. Especially early on. When someone is patient. When they don't react strongly to small imperfections. When they seem comfortable with things that I expected might bother them. For example, I might apologize for something small. Maybe I respond to a message late. Maybe I cancel plans because I'm tired. Maybe I say something awkward. And I expect the other person to react in a certain way. A little disappointment. A little irritation. A subtle shift in tone. But sometimes none of that happens. They just say something like, "No worries." And they actually mean it. They move on. They don't bring it up again. But my mind sometimes stays there longer than necessary. Because part of me is waiting for the delayed reaction. The moment when they finally say, "Actually, that bothered me." Or, "Actually, I've been thinking about something." That expectation sits quietly in the background, even when the interaction itself was completely smooth. Even when the other person has given no signal that something is wrong. It's almost like my mind expects acceptance to come with a second phase. Phase 1, calm understanding. Phase 2, the correction. The disappointment. The shift. And when phase 2 doesn't arrive right away, my system doesn't immediately relax. It waits. It watches. Sometimes this even affects how comfortable I feel sharing things. If someone accepts something about me too easily, I might start wondering whether they really heard me, whether they really understood what I meant, or whether they're just being tolerant for now. Because many of us learn, over time, that acceptance is often conditional. People accept certain versions of us, certain behaviors, certain moods. But other parts of us are harder for people to handle. So when someone appears to accept a wide range of things about us, it can feel surprising. Almost too smooth. Like watching a movie where everything goes well a little too easily. Part of the audience starts expecting a twist. Something unexpected. Something that reveals the real tension of the story. And sometimes our minds treat relationships the same way. If things feel calm and accepting, the brain quietly prepares for the moment when that calm might change. Not because it wants things to go wrong, but because it has learned to expect shifts. It has learned that people sometimes accept things at first, and then react differently later. So instead of immediately trusting the acceptance, the mind keeps a small amount of distance. Just in case. Just in case the tone changes. Just in case something about the situation turns out to be temporary. And most of the time this process is completely automatic. It's not a conscious decision. It's just a subtle habit the mind developed after seeing certain patterns repeat often enough. Patterns where acceptance felt real at the beginning, but didn't stay exactly the same once the relationship moved forward. At some point I started noticing something strange about these moments. The suspicion didn't appear when people criticized me. That part felt familiar. It didn't appear when someone corrected me, disagreed with me, or pointed out something I should improve. Those reactions were easy to understand. They followed a pattern my mind already knew. But when someone responded with calm acceptance, something inside me slowed down and began quietly analyzing the situation. Almost like my brain was trying to understand a language it hadn't practiced very much. It often shows up in very small everyday situations. For example, when I say something imperfect about myself. Maybe I admit that I felt jealous about something. Or that I avoided a difficult conversation. Or that I made a mistake I'm not proud of. Normally, when people hear things like that, there's a certain rhythm to the conversation. They might give advice. They might point out what I should do next time. Sometimes they subtly shift the topic toward fixing the problem. But occasionally someone simply listens and says something simple like, "That makes sense." Or, "I get why you felt that way." And they leave the moment exactly where it is. They don't push it somewhere else. They don't try to adjust the story. They don't suggest a better version of how I should have behaved. They just allow the moment to exist. And strangely, that kind of response sometimes makes my mind pause. Not because it's unpleasant, but because it's unfamiliar. It's like walking into a room and realizing that the usual background noise is missing. For a second you wonder if something is wrong. Because the quiet feels unusual. The same thing can happen with acceptance. When someone doesn't react with judgment, my mind sometimes starts checking the situation more carefully. Did they really understand what I meant? Did they miss part of the story? Maybe if they knew more details, their reaction would be different. Sometimes this shows up after the conversation ends. I might be doing something completely unrelated later in the day when the moment suddenly comes back into my mind. And I start replaying it. The tone of their voice. The way they responded. The expression on their face. Not in an obsessive way. Just a quiet review of the moment. Because something about it felt slightly different from what I expected. Another place where this reaction appears is when someone remains calm during situations where I expected tension. For example, imagine arriving late to meet someone. Not extremely late. Just late enough to feel a little embarrassed. You explain what happened and prepare for the small shift in mood that usually follows. The brief disappointment. The subtle frustration. But instead the other person shrugs and says, "It's okay." And the way they say it feels genuine. They don't bring it up again. They don't mention it later. They simply continue the conversation as if nothing significant happened. For some people that moment feels completely normal. But for others there's a small pause inside the mind. Because the reaction doesn't match the internal script we expected. The mind quietly wonders, are they really okay with it? Or are they just not saying anything yet? And that uncertainty sometimes stays in the background for a while. Not as anxiety. Just as quiet observation. Sometimes it even affects how comfortable I feel showing more of myself. If someone accepts something about me very quickly, part of my mind becomes curious about how far that acceptance actually goes. Not in a confrontational way. Just a quiet curiosity. Would they still react the same way if they saw other parts of me? Would they still be calm if the situation were a little more complicated? Because many of us grow up learning that acceptance often has limits. People are comfortable with certain versions of us. Certain moods. Certain behaviors. But once we move outside those invisible boundaries, the tone can change. So when someone appears to accept things easily, the mind sometimes treats it like a temporary moment rather than a stable pattern. almost like waiting to see if the atmosphere will shift later. This doesn't mean we want the shift to happen. In fact, most of us would prefer the acceptance to stay exactly as it is. But our internal expectations are shaped by previous experiences. And those expectations quietly influence how quickly we trust calm reactions. It's similar to walking across a frozen lake. Even if the ice looks solid, you still take the first few steps carefully. You test the surface. You listen for cracks. Not because you expect the ice to break immediately, but because your mind knows that stability sometimes changes without warning. Emotional acceptance can feel similar when someone isn't used to it. Even when it appears genuine, the mind takes a little time to fully stand on it. Not out of distrust toward the other person, but out of habit. A habit built from earlier moments when acceptance didn't always last as long as it first seemed. One of the places where this feeling becomes most visible is in relationships that are actually calm. Not dramatic. Not intense. Just stable. At first, that kind of relationship can feel almost confusing. Because nothing is constantly being tested. There aren't frequent emotional swings. There aren't long silent periods followed by intense conversations. Things simply move at a steady rhythm. Someone responds to your messages normally. They don't disappear for days. They don't suddenly become distant. They don't act extremely warm one moment and cold the next. And for many people, that kind of stability should feel comforting. But sometimes it creates a strange internal reaction. Part of the mind starts waiting for the moment when the pattern changes. Because when you're used to emotional shifts, calm can feel temporary. Almost like the quiet part before something happens. You might notice this in small situations. For example, when you send a message and the other person responds in a relaxed way. No tension. No hidden frustration. Just a normal reply. Logically, that should be the end of the moment. But sometimes the mind keeps looking at it from different angles. Was the tone really relaxed? Did I misread something? Maybe they were just busy. Maybe they were distracted. Maybe they'll think about it later and react differently. The mind starts filling in possible future reactions. Not because anything bad has happened, but because it has learned that calm situations sometimes change later. Another example appears when someone shows consistent interest. They keep showing up. They make plans and follow through. They stay emotionally available in a steady way. For someone who hasn't experienced that pattern very often, it can feel almost suspicious. Not because the person is doing something wrong, but because the consistency itself feels unusual. Part of the mind wonders, why are they still here? Why haven't they pulled away yet? Why haven't they become irritated? Why haven't they lost interest? Sometimes this question appears quietly after a good moment. Maybe you had a relaxed conversation. Maybe you spent time together and everything felt easy. No tension. No misunderstandings. No emotional friction. The kind of interaction people usually describe as nice. And yet later, when you're alone, your mind revisits the moment. Almost as if it's trying to find the missing problem. Because if the situation was that smooth, part of the brain wonders whether something simply hasn't appeared yet. You might even notice this during compliments. Someone says something positive about you. Not exaggerated. Not dramatic. Just something sincere. I like how calm you are in situations like that. Or, you're easy to talk to. And instead of letting the compliment settle naturally, the mind begins adjusting it. Maybe they just said that to be polite. Maybe they say that to everyone. Maybe they haven't seen the parts of me that are harder to deal with. It's almost like the mind protects itself by lowering the weight of the compliment. Because fully believing it might feel risky. If you believe it too much, and later someone reacts differently, the contrast might feel stronger. So the mind quietly keeps some distance. Not rejecting the compliment completely. Just softening its impact. This same pattern appears when people respond to mistakes calmly. For example, imagine you say something slightly awkward in a conversation. Maybe you interrupt someone accidentally. Maybe you explain something poorly. Maybe you misunderstand something they said. You notice the moment immediately. And internally you prepare for the correction. For the small tension that often follows. But the other person simply laughs lightly and continues the conversation. They don't hold on to the mistake. They don't emphasize it. They let it pass naturally. And while that response is healthy and relaxed, part of the mind sometimes lingers on the moment longer than necessary. Did they actually mind? Did they just ignore it to avoid making things uncomfortable? Will they bring it up later? It's interesting how the brain sometimes expects emotional consequences even when none appear. Not because we want conflict. But because our mind has seen enough situations where small moments eventually turned into bigger reactions. So it quietly keeps track of things. Almost like a background observer. Watching the emotional climate. Waiting to see if something changes. Over time this can create a strange experience in stable relationships. Everything appears calm on the surface. The other person behaves consistently. They communicate clearly. They don't create unnecessary tension. And yet internally, a small part of the mind keeps asking, is this really how it's going to stay? Or is this just the beginning before something shifts? The interesting thing is that this question often has very little to do with the current person. It's rarely about something they did. Most of the time it's connected to patterns that existed long before this relationship began. Patterns where acceptance slowly turned into criticism. Where patience eventually became frustration. Where calm moments were followed by unexpected emotional changes. When the brain sees that pattern enough times, it becomes cautious. Not aggressively cautious. Just quietly alert. So when a relationship appears stable and accepting, the system sometimes doesn't fully relax right away. Instead it watches. It waits. Not because it wants the calm to disappear, but because it's still learning that sometimes calm really can stay calm. At some point, if I pay close enough attention, I start noticing something interesting about these reactions. The suspicion doesn't actually come from the present moment. It comes from the comparison my mind is making. Every interaction I have today is being quietly measured against something older. Older conversations. Older relationships. Older emotional patterns. For example, imagine telling someone something personal. Not something dramatic. Just something honest. Maybe you tell them you sometimes overthink situations. Or that you tend to assume people are upset with you even when they're not. You say it almost casually. And the other person listens and simply says, "That makes sense." No judgment. No lecture. No subtle criticism hiding inside their response. Just understanding. In that moment, something unusual happens inside the mind. Part of me wants to relax. But another part pauses. Because the response doesn't match older experiences. In older situations, moments like that often led somewhere else. Maybe someone would respond with impatience. Maybe they would say something like, "You're overreacting." Or, "You worry too much." Or, You need to stop thinking like that. Those reactions create a certain emotional rhythm. You share something, they correct it. You admit something imperfect, they highlight the flaw. Over time that rhythm becomes familiar. Predictable. So when someone responds differently, with calm acceptance, the mind briefly struggles to categorize the moment. It's like hearing a song where one of the notes is different from what you expected. The brain pauses for a second. Not because the note is wrong, but because it's new. Another example appears when someone remains emotionally steady during situations that normally create tension. Imagine you forget something important. You expected them to react with frustration. You even prepared an explanation in advance. But when you apologize, they respond in a relaxed way. They shrug slightly and say, "It's okay." And then they move on. No passive-aggressive comment. No delayed reminder later in the day. No subtle emotional distance. Just a calm response that stays calm. In theory, this should feel reassuring. But when your mind is used to emotional shifts, it may take time to trust that the moment is truly finished. Because the brain sometimes expects a second stage. Stage 1, calm reaction. Stage 2, the real reaction later. Maybe during another conversation. Maybe through a change in tone. Maybe through emotional distance. So even when the calm response is genuine, the mind waits a little longer than necessary. Just to see if something else appears. Over time, if I observe this pattern carefully, I begin to realize something important. The suspicion isn't really about the other person. It's about the emotional map my brain learned earlier in life. That map was built from repeated experiences. Moments where acceptance had limits. Moments where people initially seemed understanding but later reacted differently. Moments where being fully seen eventually led to criticism, disappointment, or withdrawal. When enough experiences follow that pattern, the brain becomes efficient. It stops waiting for the full pattern to unfold. Instead, it anticipates it. It prepares early. Not in an obvious way, but in subtle ways. By questioning acceptance. By analyzing calm responses. By assuming that the current moment might change later. From the brain's perspective, this anticipation once served a useful purpose. If you expect emotional shifts early, you feel more prepared when they happen. You're less surprised. Less exposed. But there's a small side effect. When acceptance is genuine, the brain still applies the same protective strategy. It keeps a little emotional distance until it gathers enough evidence that the situation is truly different. And evidence takes time. Because one calm reaction doesn't change the internal map immediately. Two calm reactions might still feel like exceptions. Even 3 or 4 might feel temporary. The brain slowly collects moments. Moments where someone remains steady. Moments where acceptance doesn't disappear later. Moments where honesty doesn't trigger criticism. Little by little, those moments start forming a new pattern. But that process doesn't happen instantly. Trusting acceptance sometimes requires multiple experiences that look similar. Conversations where someone listens without correcting. Situations where mistakes don't create tension. Moments where vulnerability doesn't lead to distance. As those experiences repeat, the brain begins adjusting its expectations. The emotional map gradually expands. It starts including new possibilities. Possibilities where acceptance isn't temporary. Where calm responses are actually genuine. Where someone can see imperfect parts of you and still remain comfortable. And when that new pattern slowly becomes familiar, something interesting begins to happen. The suspicion fades a little faster each time. The mind stops replaying conversations as often. Compliments start landing more naturally. Calm reactions start feeling less unusual. Not because the past disappeared, but because the brain finally has enough present experiences to build a new reference point. A reference point where acceptance doesn't automatically signal a hidden condition. Sometimes it simply means exactly what it looks like. Someone saw something about you, and chose to stay calm about it. Eventually, something small begins to change in the way these moments feel. Not all at once. Not in a dramatic way. Just gradually. At first the suspicion still appears. Someone accepts something about me and the familiar question quietly shows up, why are they okay with that? But over time another thought sometimes appears right after it. A quieter thought. Maybe they really are okay with it. That second thought doesn't erase the first one immediately. Both thoughts exist for a while. The cautious one. And the curious one. The cautious part still watches the situation carefully. It still notices tone, timing, reactions. But the curious part begins to observe something different. It starts noticing patterns that weren't there before. For example, someone listens to something imperfect about me, and nothing bad happens afterward. The conversation continues normally. The relationship doesn't become tense. The person doesn't suddenly withdraw. A few days later, they still interact the same way. No hidden irritation. No delayed correction. Just normal presence. And the mind quietly registers that. Then another moment happens later. Maybe I say something awkward again. Maybe I misunderstand something. Maybe I show a side of myself that isn't perfectly polished. And again the reaction stays calm. The person doesn't make it into a problem. They don't seem uncomfortable. They don't treat the moment like a flaw that needs fixing. They simply accept it and continue. At first the brain still hesitates. Maybe it's just coincidence. Maybe they're unusually patient today. Maybe the shift will happen later. But as similar moments accumulate, the internal system begins noticing something important. The pattern isn't changing. The acceptance isn't disappearing. And slowly the mind begins relaxing its constant scanning. Not completely. But a little more each time. It starts realizing that not every interaction follows the old rhythm. Not every moment of vulnerability leads to criticism. Not every mistake creates distance. Sometimes people really do respond with calm acceptance. And they continue responding that way later. That realization can feel surprisingly unfamiliar at first. Because when you spend a long time expecting emotional shifts, stability almost feels like a new environment. Like walking into a place where the air feels different. You move slowly at first. You test the space. But eventually your body begins adjusting. The same thing happens emotionally. Instead of analyzing every calm reaction, the mind begins allowing some moments to simply exist. Someone listens and says, "That makes sense." And instead of replaying the moment later, the brain gradually lets the conversation end where it ended. Someone accepts something imperfect about you, and the mind doesn't immediately search for the hidden condition. It simply registers the acceptance and moves forward. That shift doesn't mean becoming naive. It doesn't mean assuming everyone will always respond that way. It simply means allowing the present moment to have its own shape. Instead of forcing it to match older experiences. Because sometimes the people in front of us are different from the people our mind learned those patterns from. They respond differently. They stay calmer. They don't turn every imperfection into a problem. And when those moments repeat enough times, something subtle begins to grow. Not blind trust, but a quiet sense of possibility. The possibility that acceptance doesn't always come with an expiration date. The possibility that someone can see ordinary, imperfect parts of you, and remain completely comfortable. And when that possibility starts feeling more real, something else begins to happen inside the mind. The constant anticipation softens. The background tension fades slightly. You stop watching every interaction as if it might suddenly change direction. Instead, you start allowing relationships to move at the pace they're actually moving. Not the pace your past experiences prepared you for. And in those moments, something simple but powerful becomes easier to experience. Relief. Not the dramatic kind. Just the quiet relief of realizing that you don't have to analyze every sign of acceptance. Sometimes when someone responds calmly, when they listen, when they remain steady, it doesn't mean they missed something. It doesn't mean they're pretending. It doesn't mean they're waiting to change their mind later. Sometimes it simply means they saw the moment exactly as it was, and they were completely okay with it. And learning to recognize that kind of acceptance, slowly, patiently, moment by moment, is often the first step toward trusting that some relationships really can stay calm even after someone sees who you are.